So today we are talking about the soprano clarinet etudes number 36, 32, and 24. And we will be also talking about low clarinet etudes at around 11 o'clock. All right, so you asked for it. It's your least favorite etude. We're going to start with number 36. So the most challenging part of number 36 would have to be the octave slurs. We don't do this very often as clarinetists because we overblow at the 12th, the octave plus the 5th. When we put the register key down on C, it goes up to a G. So that's what feels easiest to us. When we're doing octave slurs, we want to aim for resonance. We want to aim for keeping the clarinet still. You might notice that your head wants to come up and down. And we're aiming for consistency of air, an easy start of the high notes. So the very first thing we're all going to do to help us get our air going, I want you to scoot to the front of your chair, stretch your arms up to the sky, and you're going to fold over your legs. Hopefully you have enough room. Fold your legs, your arms behind your legs, and breathe in. And breathe out. And breathe in. And out. One more time in. Out. And come slowly up. All right, so you hopefully felt that in your back. When we're breathing and we're using fast, consistent air, we need to use our whole body, our sides, our back, and not just our lungs. Okay? So before I'm going to attempt octave slurs, I'm going to check my air. I want you to all take your hand in front of your mouth, and you're going to aim at the top of your middle finger. And I want you to aim for cool air. It's cool, like if you're trying to cool off soup. And I want you to aim for focused air. And I want you to aim for fast air. Now I want you to blow like you're fogging up a window. You feel the difference? It's fat or wide, and it's slow, and it's quite hot. Go back to the cold air. And a really cool exercise to try if you're struggling with these octave slurs is to take your stand. I think you can all see my stand now. I'm gonna blow the piece of paper against the stand and hold it there. Even better if you have a coffee straw or a Capri Sun straw or any type of small straw. You have a cool party trick, and you can hold the piece of paper against the stand. And that's the kind of air we want on the clarinet, the exact kind of air. Okay, so one thing we're going to do to warm up, because it is 10 in the morning, and some of you might have rolled out of bed, we're going to use a slow triad in wide skips to warm up. So we're going to start on this F, but we're going to try and start from nothing. So when we do that, we want to hear the air sound first. And we're just using air to make the sound bigger. We're not using embouchure pressure. And if you notice, it's efficient and somewhat relaxed air. It's very fast, it's very focused, but it's not like you're trying to blow out 89 birthday candles. That's not going to get us very far. So everyone with your clarinet, go ahead and try that, starting the F from nothing. You might think before you start of a Frosty milkshake or a Whataburger Dr. Pepper shake. And think of 2 breaths in and start blowing out without moving your embouchure at all. Stillness of your embouchure is going to be very helpful for you with these octave slurs. So again, this is a great little warm-up when you know you're going to have to play octave slurs, which you know you got to do it, so let's get it done. All right, once you get that going, we've snuck in a double octave, very widely spaced. So you'll go ahead and play through those notes and feel for stillness of the embouchure. As it gets more comfortable, you'll be able to go back and forth more easily. Does that all make sense so far? All right, please don't be afraid to yell out yes or to say things. It's fun when I'm doing these Zoom classes for me to not feel quite so alone on the other side with my screen. Now we're going to do an exercise using twelfths, but it's going to help us relieve tension. So I tell my students to think about this like a ski slope. You're sending your air to the end of the slur. So we're going to go C, C, G, all the way to the end of the slur. Sending it there. And then at the end, you're going to leave it hanging and resonant. You're going to add in that last note. And then eventually, we're going to be able to come back down easily, and finally, to do the 12th back and forth. A lot of times we get stuck on the high note because we start to squeeze. Our jaw starts to creep up. The jaw is a huge indicator of tension, and sometimes we don't feel it. We don't notice it. It's a very sneaky form of tension. So one of the best ways to fight it, good news, 10 in the morning, I'm going to tell you to yawn. Even better, yawn with your lips closed. It's a great resonance exercise and also a good skill for early morning Zoom meetings. All right, so the last thing I'm going to ask you to do with this exercise is to think of singing the interval backwards and forwards on he. He, he. So this is a he like with an H at the end. He, fast air. And then you can also say he to make a connection. So many times when we do big intervals, we think he, ha, and you can feel the jaw move. Everyone try saying that. He, ha, and feel your jaw. That's not going to be good news for your embouchure. So we want to go he. All right, so let's get to the music, right? That's what we're all here for. When we're looking at the actual octave slurs in 36, I'm going to start with the ones before 35 because I think they're really good for this. We have a couple options. We can skeletonize, which I like to say is playing the bones of the phrase. We're going to play every other note, and you get an idea for the structure of the phrase. So you can do the bottom one. And the top one. And you have an idea of where you're going. So in duple, it comes out to every other note. If you're in triple, it's going to be the strong note of each group, the first of each group of 3. So each time we're listening for consistent air. Now, when we're looking for voicing for this, if we try and place each individual note, we're going to end up with he, and we're going to get really stressed and very tense. So my voicing tip is to start with the highest note and create space and resonance, and you're going to play it backwards. So for example, at 35, we're going to start with the high F. And we're going to practice going down. So once you're comfortable going from the high F to the F below it, you're going to go to the D. He, instead of he, ha, he, he. And then we can add in more. And eventually, once that's really easy to do, you can start turning it back around. And it'll feel a lot easier. Because again, we've started our voicing prerogative with the highest one instead of focusing on reaching up to it, we're thinking about hee coming down to the next note, which is a much less stressful thing to do. Another great strategy for this, because our lips tend to grab onto the end of a slur, what we can do is a double articulation. So you want to take this a little slower. And that'll help you to keep the air consistent because you're aiming towards the second articulation. And that fast air at the end will help you actually release. Sometimes we think we have to have control of the end of the note by really squeezing on it, and that generally doesn't work. If you think back and remember when you first learned how to bike and you had to turn and you were really nervous and you thought, I'll slow down as much as I can so I can control everything, and you actually can't control the bike when it's slow. So a lot of times that ends up being a disastrous strategy. It's also good, of course, to practice these slowly. I'm a huge fan of slow practice, but you want to make sure that you're not building up tension when you do it slowly. So make sure it's healthy, slow practice, and you're practicing confidence. So I sometimes alternate that with chunking. Instead of always starting at the beginning and going slowly to the end, so by the end you're kind of tired and it's makes a big deal out of the end. Instead, you can use chunking. So you might do groups of 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, or 13 notes going forward. Like, for instance, oh, I made it so small here on my page. So I'm looking at 53. So I'm working in chunks so that I have a goal each time and it's moving forward instead of da da dee getting slower and slower and tighter and tighter. Another really great strategy to build confidence for the end is to start from the arrival point. So for instance, at 55, you might have noticed this is a very tense spot. You can start at the arrival. And you can build into it. So you're building confidence instead of building dread. That's always a good thing. Does anyone have any questions about that so far? Nope. Is that all helpful? Things maybe you haven't tried yet? All right, good. I'm glad to see a lot of faces and I'm glad to see a lot of clarinets. That's good to see. All right, did we list any spots that we hate yet in the chat? I was really looking forward to seeing that. Nope, no spots, but it's helpful. That's good. Okay. I think there were a couple more things to go over in number 36 because it's not all about the octave slurs, right? There are other things going on. So we'll pull it back up. Okay. So another thing going on in this etude is the articulation. We want to match the ends of the notes, and this is going to help the style of the piece. If the notes do not match, we get a little unbalanced, and it doesn't sound as graceful. We really want it to sound buoyant. I like to think of the buoyancy you feel when you push something underwater and let it float back up. Each measure, bum, bum, bee, it wants to float back up. Now, my students know that we do silly things, so they're comfortable with it. I don't know if you are or not, but I'm going to ask you to actually stand up, and we're going to get a good feel for this piece by walking it. So for instance, I would think walking side to side. Bum, bum, beam, bum, bum, beam, bum, bum, beam, bum, bum, bum. And in that way we can feel the weight going to the downbeat again. Bum, bum, beam, bum, beam, bum. And then you can even try playing it. The important part are going to be those eighth notes at the beginning. So if you lose your feet for the 16th notes, don't worry too much. You just want to feel that for the eighth notes. This piece, you know, we got to love it because we're going to live with it for a while. This piece, it's very easy for it to be boring. It's very repetitive. Bop, bop, beep, bop, beep, bum. And so when we play it for Allstate, we want to think that you're going to play it among, you know, probably 70 other people. The judges are going to hear it so many times. So it will be like a breath of fresh air when they hear someone play it musically. Most people will be very worried about the octave slurs and the technique, and they're not going to be thinking about the style. Now, to get the clear articulation at the end, I have another little strategy. So you're going to, just like in the picture below, you can't quite see the bell in it, but you're going to place the bell between your knees, and you're going to rest the clarinet on your lower lip. And we're going to do something, this is the slide of silly things. I'm sorry, not sorry. But I learned from vocalists that embodying what you want to sound like is very, very helpful. So we already did it with our feet. Now we're going to do it with our hand for our air. So we're going to play left hand notes only, like the C, the E, and the G. And you can even just repeat it on a C. But you're going to throw a dart at the same time that you start the note. So I don't know if you've ever thrown a dart before. You can also imagine throwing a paper airplane. But if you're not very good at it like me, you've probably had the paper airplane go straight down to the ground. That happens when we release too late. And this happens a lot with our articulation. We tighten up the air and we send f, and we don't get any resonance. Instead, you want to think he, not he, so that it's still going up when you release the note. It's still getting faster, and that's what's going to give it a lovely arc. Go ahead and try that. You can even try 3 in a row. Does anyone want to be a brave volunteer and try it? Someone, go for it. Raise your hand. Go for it. I see some nice starts. Otherwise, I'll have to pick on someone that I know. No, are we still shy? Okay, that's all right. The next one. We'll jump in on the next one. Okay. So, once we have that dart-like air going, you can try it with your right hand again. He. It's also really helpful to say it. We never like to sing or say our music because we're like, I play an instrument. I don't do any of that stuff. But it's so helpful to visualize how you want it to sound. If you can't sing it right, you can't play it right. Unfortunately, this rule is pretty much always true. Okay, I'm going to have to keep this moving so that we get to all of the etudes and the bass clarinet etudes. The other important thing in number 36 is to think about the decorations. There are many trills, and you want to plan your trills. You want to know exactly how many turns you'll do, and you want to practice getting in and out of it gracefully. So you think of a gymnast sticking a landing. You know, I love watching the Olympics. Gymnastics is probably my favorite. And whatever happens before, they stick the landing. And so if you missed it, you'd be like, wow, that must have been awesome. And maybe they go back and they cry afterwards. But it's important that they show that they believe in their product and they put it out there. And that's the same thing you need to do in your audition. So it's possible to do one turn. which becomes a total of 5 notes with the grace notes, because we always have to come back to the note we started on. So for that very first trill, we'd be going G, A, G, F sharp, G, A. That'd be 5 notes. Or you can do 2 turns, which would be a total of 7 notes. I'm going to make an argument for both of them, and eventually that's a choice that you and your band director are going to make. So if we're going to practice getting into it, that would be 2 turns, and I'm going to practice getting to the F sharp. And then I'm going to practice getting to the G sharp. And then I would practice getting to the A. And that's how that would work. If I did just 1 trill, I would make sure that that's very accurate and the same each time. Now, my first argument for the 2 trills is because we have another type of decoration, and we want to make sure that they sound quite different. The trill followed by the grace note should feel free and move forward without an accent on the 8th note. It's driving forward. The grace notes following the accented 8th should feel slightly suspended, and they should emphasize the 8th note. So it's kind of dramatic and suspenseful, because it makes us wait. We're like, are we going to go on? Beep bum ba da lum bum be lum. Where is that? Dee da da dum bum dee da da dum. So we want to make sure that sounds different from the trills. Personally, I think it sounds the most different when I do 2 turns for the grace note and emphasize the accent and the fastness of the grace notes in the second decoration. I'm going to play a little bit for it. So do you hear how the accented 8ths hang back a little bit and the trills move forward to the next note? It's going to be a very stylistic, very important detail that's going to set you out from the others. All right, one other thing we can do to make those accents really cool is to practice backwards accents. So what we're doing when we do backwards accents is to shape the note with the air and not with the tongue. Sometimes we think an accent, oh, I'm going to hit it really hard, like a percussion instrument, bam! But unfortunately, we get the most resonance with our air, not with our tongue. The tongue stops the reed from vibrating. So if we want a big arrival, we need to use the air. I ask my students to start with a small amount of air, he, and then think of it. So an accent starts loud and gets soft. We're going to start soft and get loud. A very micro crescendo, he, and that will help you control the air instead of relying on the tongue. And then you can try doing it. He, and you're going to feel kind of a kick from your belly. I like to think of it like a cute mini little Heimlich, he. It just gives it a little kick. And once you can confidently do that, then you can do it forwards. What's really important with the accent is that there's a resonant tail to it. The tail has to be softer to show where we came from. If we just go, da, we don't have enough tail and we can't really tell what happened. We're like, that was a really loud note. What happened? But if we go, ta, we can hear that it's a very purposeful accent. And it creates nice contrast. All right, so we talked about phrasing, thinking of a wheel or stepping it. So we want the gravity that pulls towards the end of each group of 3 or group of 6. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1. You can also Sing and conduct, I recommend using a circle. So bum bum beam bum bum beam beep ba ba da dee ba 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 beam bum bum beam. So you can feel the momentum as you come around to come down. And everybody can circle conduct. You don't have to be a famous person with a stick to do it. Anyone can circle conduct at home. And so for those 16th notes, I'm thinking 1 and 2 and 3 and, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Either of those will work. The other thing to keep in mind for the phrasing, since it's very repetitive, anytime you see an accidental, look at that note carefully. It might be a leading tone if it's going up to a half step above it. Or you might want to emphasize it because it's a new note in this etude that's mostly just arpeggiations. All right? Does anyone have any other questions about number 36? No questions? Let me check the chat. This is your least favorite etude, although not by so much. 15 say least favorite, and otherwise it's split between 24 and 32. All right then. Well, if there are no questions, I'm going to move on to 15, which is, oh, sorry, not 15. I'm going to move to 24. My number is off. This should be 24. All right. So in this one, I really suggest using patterns for practice. We have a lot of 16th notes, and it's going to sound very obvious if they're not even. So we play a fun game in my studio where we learn our scales and we learn any 16th note passages with our groupings. So the grouping is set so that you can hear any hesitation in your fingers. Usually when we just play it on quarter notes, like if we're going to go 104 here. There it is. So 104 here. Oh, the metronome doesn't want to work. It's okay. Always have a backup metronome. It's very easy to go faster in the middle of the beat. It kind of sags and goes faster, and that means that we don't have enough control over the notes. What we're going to do instead, we're going to put that metronome on a smaller pulse. So if I'm thinking 1 E and a 2 E and a 1 E and a 2, I can speed up in the middle and still arrive on the next downbeat. But what I'm going to do instead, I'm going to put on triplets. And if you look, the first pattern I have there under groupings of 4, we've got 2 long notes and 2 short shorts. So the long is going to fit in 1 triplet beat, and the 2 shorts are going to fit in 1 triplet beat. Long, long, short, short, long. Long, long, short, short, long. So that goes by a little fast. Let's go to the other recommended. And a way I could do this here. Long, long, short, short, long, long, short, short, long. And then I can also do it. So I'm relaxing my tongue using burst articulation, and I can do. So both of those things are helping me to go faster. I can send these slides. If anyone wants a copy of these slides, please just email me. There's a slide at the end saying to email me, and I will send them along to you. But it's important to remember that each long receives 1 click of the triplet and 2 shorts fit in 1 click. So there's only 1 click of the metronome where we're trying to fit more than 1 note. And that means that as soon as our fingers hesitate, we know. And not only do we know exactly which finger hesitated. And diagnostics are the most important part of practicing. We can sit there all day long and do it over and over again, but if we don't know why it wasn't working, we can't truly fix it. Just like a doctor, if he doesn't really know why, he's only treating the symptoms, and maybe you feel a little bit better, but you're not cured. So we need to make sure we go straight to the source and zap it. All right, another good way to speed this one up is to practice backwards. By now you're like, oh my God, Dr. VR does everything backwards. And I kind of do. There's a good reason for it. Every action we do needs to be symmetrical. So when we breathe in, we need a symmetrical breath out. We don't go, that'll create tension. So if we're going to play a slow piece, we take a slow breath in. If we're going to play a fast piece, we probably go, and we breathe in time. The other thing that needs to be symmetrical is the approach of our tongue to the reed and what it does when it comes away, and our fingers with the keys, how they come to the key and how they come away. So when we practice backwards, we make the end of the note the beginning. So if the end of the note has slow air and our lips are gripping, if we make it the beginning, we have to send faster air. And if we're having trouble with lifting the fingers when we make it the beginning, that's what we practice. So it's really good. For example, I would start, this is the very first measure, I'm going to start on the B flats. So the very first time I played it, I noticed that I had trouble going from the B flat to the A flat. And many of you probably would notice this as well. Go ahead and try it. B, 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 A, da, da. If you're having trouble, you need to rethink how your fingers are getting to the A flat key. I like to tell my students to think like this finger just fell asleep, like it's very tired or narcoleptic, and it just, but what it doesn't do is lift, and what it doesn't do is kick the other fingers out. We want to keep everything hovering over its hole, so bada. And then all of a sudden, we have a little more lift. Another thing you can do is the ski slope exercise. To make sure that it's fast at the end. All of those things will help. Now, when we have a run that goes higher, we have quite a few in this that go up and down, or start up and go down, and then up, down, up, down. We want to make sure that we're finding our voicing from the highest note. So if I go to 45, I want to start adding notes going down, making sure that everything's the same. Instead of going hee 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 ha, and slowing down the air and losing the resonant space behind your teeth. Okay, so you wouldn't guess it by looking at it. Most of us look at number 24 and say, oh, it's a fast etude with articulation. That's what it's about. But it's actually got a lot to do with hand position. So if your hands fly away, if your hands are extra tense, if your hands cramp down, it's really going to bother you on this etude, especially since it has sections like the one on this slide. So what we want to do is avoid the claw. What do I mean by the claw? The claw. It's tense. We also want to avoid the stick straight pinkies, which causes the rest of the fingers to claw. No claws, just hands. So shake your hands out and bring it up, and it should be a nice, easy C. I like to say, since we're in Texas, it's like you're going to eat a Whataburger. It's a perfect shape. You could also pick up a can of Coke, anything like that. Now, when we place it on the clarinet, what's the first finger that we usually place? Does anyone know? Try it. What part of your hand do you put on the clarinet first? A lot of times it's this, right? We grab with our thumb and our first finger. Well, you only have one thumb on each hand. So why does the thumb get to decide for all the other fingers? Who put it in charge? It's also the most mobile, right? It can move all around. So we shouldn't place our hands for our thumbs. I want you to forget you have a thumb. You're going to shake your hand out, bring it up, and then I want you to put your thumb up like you're going to hitchhike. And then you're going to place your fingers on the holes. And your pinky should be living at this home position on the E, B key. And I want you to practice lifting each finger from the knuckle. So that means I'm lifting from that spot right there. And I still haven't put my thumb down. Have you resisted? That's good. Some of you have resisted. Now you're going to take your thumb and you're going to make a windshield wiper motion. Look at all that mobility. Why did you ever let it choose where to put your hand? Now you're going to bring it down over the register key so that it's like half of a pirate X. And the idea is that when it slides to the register key, you don't have to lift up your whole wrist. Your wrist should be still. And at that point, it makes it much easier to do the section because your hands are close. There's one more secret that's going to get in your way with this etude. So your left hand thumb, not only does it try to decide where everyone else should go on the clarinet, but it also feels like it can do whatever it wants. And if you watch it, you'll notice that it rebounds really far. And a lot of times it's because your pinky is not staying in home base. If your left hand thumb stays close, you can get around easily. If it lifts, all of a sudden you're getting farther and farther in on the clarinet and you're not sure and you're nervous and it's a bad situation. It'll get sloppier and sloppier. So keep it nice and close. And you can practice it in little bits. So that you can monitor your thumb. It's like a 2-year-old. You can't let it alone or it will break everything and get into everything. Another thing to watch is the left hand first finger. So you want to practice going between these notes. F sharp, that's our G flat to B flat, and F to B flat. So if your left hand first finger is jumping too far up, it's going to encourage your thumb to go too far up as well because they move as a unit. So just like it fell asleep on the A flat key, this finger also needs to fall asleep on the A key. You can even practice to make sure you have mobility. So I'm trilling to the A without lifting my finger off the key. When I can do that, I can lift it with just a slight rock instead of a big rock. And at that point, I can practice going back and forth on each of those intervals. Another sign of tension in your hands is when the joints collapse, like that. We've all seen it happen to our hands, even to the best of us. Even when we fix it, a lot of times it'll come back. This means that your finger is not moving from the joint, from the knuckle, but it's moving from another hinging point, which is not going to work as well, and it kind of delays the action because it has to lie down all the way. Sometimes we get a worm. You want to watch out for the worm. Sometimes we get a cobra that's like, ha, yeah. Instead, fluid movement from here, and you'll have easy technique throughout this etude. All right, I like to call these sand traps because they're the mistakes that everybody's going to fall in. So when we go to an audition, we want to be the person that stands out. And a lot of times that means not falling in the sand trap. So there are a couple of things I'm going to suggest. The repetitive patterns at 19, 20, and I think it's, 23, 24 can be quite difficult because finger tension builds up. I'm going to encourage you to think of that symmetry and to go the other way. So I'm going to start, you can see my cursor, I'm going to start on this note. It's always important to look at the key signature when you play backwards. So this is going to be a G flat. I'm going to go G flat, F, E flat, C. And get comfortable playing that. The reason I do it is that I lead to the slur instead of grabbing and slowing down on the slur. I'm going hee hee hee, and I'm leading forward, which is very good. Then you can turn it into a loop. So I'm starting on the G flat, I'm going he, 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 he. Sorry, you have to listen to my singing. And all of a sudden, when I can do it looped back and forth, it's much easier to play it as written. One rule of practice that I always live by is find what's difficult, make it even more difficult, challenge yourself, and then all of a sudden the written music on the page will be easier. So we diagnose what was wrong and we fix it even better than it was. And then we go after it. Now, since the theme of this year's TMEA auditions is octave slurs, of course in this etude we have octave slurs as well. What's a little more difficult about these is that they have a crescendo in them. So I can't emphasize this enough, but please practice from the very beginning with a crescendo. If we add the dynamics at the end, we're going to add a lot of tension. But if you do it at the beginning, and you do it like we did the other time with 2-note groups going down, so going backwards and down, and 3-note groups. For example, I'm going to start on this G right here. And again, I'm looking at the key signature carefully, so I go to the A flat afterwards. And then it's easier to go through there. You'll notice that some notes carry more tension than others. Sorry about my phone. I don't know who's calling me. And the ones that are going to carry the most tension are going to be the A flat and the G flat. So make sure that when you get to them, they sound resonant. And if you don't know what resonant is and you're not sure, you're like Dr. VR said, resonant, I really don't know. Try throwing the dart. And it will be a lot easier to move through it. Okay? So that's my suggestion for that. Another very important thing in this etude is going to be forward phrasing. Always thinking 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And this is especially important in measure 43. 43 has another little hand position issue for us. You'll find that if your pinky strays, or if you ever play an E with too many fingers, I'm sure your band directors love this, when all the fingers dogpile on top of each other. If your pinky strays, it's going to be really hard to play 43. If it's hovering over here, you can practice 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and then it's easier to add it back in. And I'm watching my pinkies to make sure that they're curved. Not da-da-da-da, because all of a sudden I lose accuracy when I do that. And I think we get this straight pinky complex because we think we have to really hit it, but place your finger on it gently and press it down. Feel how little action it actually takes to press it down. It's not much. It's a very light key. And that's a good thing. So sometimes I like to think about pushing it down and letting the key push my finger back up so that I'm not slapping it. All right. Do we have any questions about 24? No? We're not very chatty, are we? That's okay. It's early. I understand. And it's Saturday. Y'all are here. That's amazing. As I said, I'm going to put the slides out. I'm going to also try and put out a class that you can access later on YouTube. So if you ever want to revisit and be like, that went by really fast, I'm not quite sure what happened, you'll be able to go back to it. Does that sound good? Okay. I see some nods. Excellent. All right. Last etude. Let's get it done. If we have any bass clarinets joining us, this is going to be a bass clarinet etude as well, which is really exciting. I'm always a champion for the bass clarinet It can play really beautiful melodies, and sometimes we just give it very boring parts. So it's fun to see them sharing an etude this year. All right. So when we get to the slow etude, a lot of us think it's a throwaway piece, you know. It's so much easier. I'm not going to practice it because I don't have to. I can play the notes. But you need to be able to stand out on the slow etude. A lot of times when we get to all state level, everyone can play the notes, but there are only a few that are musical, and those are the ones that advance. So whenever we do an audition, we're not thinking about trying to be good enough. We're trying to think about being the best we can possibly be. We always want to win. We do our best. So to stand out in the slow etude, you need to have good rhythm, a steady pulse, accurate subdivisions, and you need to plan your breaths practically, but also musically. So make sure you're not taking a breath just because it's marked and just because you need it. Make sure it fits into your phrase. How do we make a phrase? Dynamics are very important in the phrase. So we're phrasing with the written dynamics. And to do that, that means we have control throughout the registers. This note's not just boo coming out like that because it's hard to play it soft. We play it exactly where we want it to be. When it pops out, we call that the clarinet playing you. You want to play the clarinet. Tell the clarinet where to put it. You're in charge. So we're looking for a better range of dynamics. One of the most important things that I see all the time is that someone sees a decrescendo and they really want to do it and they start it too soon. So anytime you see a decrescendo, the very top of it, think that's where you establish where you're coming from. So I had a teacher who always told me that decrescendos, instead of looking like that, they should look like. So you see it stayed big and then it got smaller, kind of exponentially. We've all learned a lot this summer about what exponential means. All right, so musicality, it's also important to know where you're going to and where you're coming from. Sometimes I look through a piece and I find the arrivals. I might put a star on them, and then I decide which arrival is the most important, which one speaks to me the most musically. And I'm going to share that special moment with the people listening. So often we go into an audition and we want to impress people, but that's not what music is for. Music is not about impressing people. It can be fun sometimes, but music is about communicating something. So we want to find what's special about the piece for us and show it to the jury. And then they'll go, oh, I feel noticed. I feel that's great. So I also talked about singing. Yes, please, really, please sing your etude. Try it. You can lock yourself in your room. You can do it in the shower. You can do it anywhere where you feel safe. But try singing it, and you'll see that you connect much better through the wider intervals and that you notice where the notes are not going anywhere. I call those stale notes or plateau notes. Another really good way to stand out is to use a drone when you practice. Tonal energy is my favorite. And if you practice with the drone, you'll notice when you're not in tune with yourself, when your intervals are strange. This could be your throat tones are really flat. Sometimes when we just automatically put down resonance fingers, we end up playing with very flat throat tones. And those are things the jury's going to hear. All right, so how do we go about having good rhythm? I would suggest feeling the pulse in eighth notes because we never want to have to guess. And I'm guessing that most of you have trouble counting 32 notes. 30-second notes are very small and sometimes our brain can't comprehend them. But if we put our metronome on eighth notes, and to do that, some of them have a fancy setting where you can just put it on eighth notes, and some of them actually don't, but what you do is you just take it times 2. Or if it's in 6/8 or 9/8, you take it times 3. So the written tempo here, we have 58. If I take it times 2, 60 times 2 is 120. So I'm going to put 116. Oops, I still have triplets on. That was exciting. So if I'm thinking in eighth notes, right at the very beginning, I have a double dotted eighth note. What could that possibly mean? The first dot means add half of the note. So we add half of the note, which is a 16th note. So it's an 8th note plus a 16th note. The second dot means add half of the note. So now we're adding a 16th note and a 32nd note, which makes it 3 32nd notes past an 8th note. So we have to think 1 and a 2 and da bum bum. I think 1 and a 2 and da da dum. And if you can pull that off and make that dramatic and in time, the judge will notice. This is a huge sound trap in 32. Lots of people are going to miss it, and it's very important. The other thing you can do with the 8th note pulse is practice conducting again. And 1 and 1 and 1 and a 1 and a triplet, 1 E and a 1 E and a 1 E and a. So I'm using my circle conduct, and I'm going between 2s, which would be the 16th notes, 3s, which would be the 16th note triplets, and 4s, which would be the 32nd notes, on top of my 8th note pulse. So I can move it, and I still feel my pulse. Another really important thing for this piece is to create your own dynamic world for this excerpt. I get really excited about this part. You find the softest, most expressive point, and you label it a 1. And it is the most special moment. And then you find the loudest and most expressive point, and you label it a 10. And that is also one of the most special moments, though I personally like the soft moments best. You choose. Maybe you like the louds. And then everything else has to fit in that context. You can change that context, but always think about why you're doing it. So I will actually take the marked crescendos and decrescendos, and I'll write like, okay, it's a mezzo forte. I'm going to start at a 5. I'm going to go 5 and 6 and 7 and then maybe I'm going to come away. But I'm not going to come away because I have a decrescendo at the next one. So I'm going to go 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10. Ta-dum. And I'm going to come away. So I got to 10 pretty fast. I might want to do something a little different. 5, 6, and then maybe I get to an 8. But you get to choose that. And it'll help you to think about which notes are going to and which notes are coming from. The other helpful tip for 32 is to know the meanings of the words in your music. Know them and know that when it comes back, maybe it has a different meaning. You wouldn't believe how many people don't know what the words mean, and it helps. Editors aren't always right, but they are helpful, and it's on the page, so the TMEA judges are going to expect to hear it. Now the next thing is that we plan the breaths so they reflect the phrase instead of interrupting it. These etudes usually have too many breaths, and we don't need all of them. For example, before 35, we don't need all of the breaths that were marked. So if you don't need it, don't take it. And even if you do take it, plan through it. So know what dynamic you stop at the end of your breath and start exactly there when you start again. For example, at 15, if I were to come in too loud, it's hard to hear them when you're inside your head, but record it and go back to it. Okay? So just a couple other sand traps in number 32. We talked about the beginning with the double dotted 8th note, and we didn't talk about these other two. So when we have the trill into the 16th note triplets, we need a graceful trill dismount. All right? That means we need to know exactly how long we're holding it and how we're getting out of it. So if I put it back on 8th notes, think of those grace notes as happening on the second half of the last eighth note. And then it'll be much easier. Now we also have to make sure those 32nd notes sound different. And all of it leads forward. Ba-da-dee-dum. And another important thing with the dynamics to remember in this spot is that right after that, there's a piano. Most people are going to want to come away in those 32nd notes. I should find it on the page. Nope, there it is. And then I have time in that fermata to come out of it. Okay? The last thing to go over, we have this big run before 45. Now, a lot of people will think to use the alternate fingering a little earlier, but I personally prefer to wait until there, which means you do have to switch once, which you would want to isolate it and practice it. So that it feels easier, but it gets too sloppy if we add the alternate fingering here, because it can be hard to get from the E to the F sharp. But if you want to, you can try it. Again, alternate fingerings should make things easier, and they don't always work the same for everybody. So you try it and you see. All right, so to end this, I want to invite you to follow me on Instagram for more practice tips. I also have Read Geek tutorials. I'm a Read Geek artist, and you can send me questions and messages. I'm going to be posting some videos on the All-State Etudes this week especially. And if you're thinking about becoming a javelina or majoring in music, I'm happy to give you a free lesson. You can email me at andrea.vossrochefort@tamuk.edu, and I can also give you advice if you're applying to other schools and help you with your TMEA Etudes. I'm happy to help. And as I mentioned, we have a virtual clarinet clinic on October 29th with Stas Chernyshev, who's the principal clarinetist of the Fort Worth Symphony. He's going to show us how he makes reeds, which is really cool. We're also going to have a recital. He's going to play the Copeland concerto, and we're also going to play the Mendelssohn Concertstück together, both of them. So that'll be a really fun recital, and we're going to stream it so you can attend from far away. And we also have a new thing at TMUC this year. We are working in focus groups. All of my students, they're in groups of 5 or 6. Some of them are working on articulation, some on intonation, some hand position, some voicing or altissimo, and there's even a group for bass clarinet. So each week they get special exercises to work on, and they work on them together without me, and I also meet with them and explain them, and you're welcome to join us. So if you're a band director and you have a student this would be perfect for, go ahead and send me an email. If you're a student and you just want more community practicing, it can be very isolating when we're all on our lonesome in our rooms. So I'm happy to involve you in that. Just reach out to me. Okay? Any questions? Okay, so I love that I'm getting some answers in the chat about that. Please go ahead and email it to me, because I'm going to be moving to another clinic after this, and I might not be able to keep them all straight, who's soprano clarinet and who's bass clarinet. So please send me an email. I'm going to put it in the chat. And yeah, any other questions? Can you do me a favor? Tell me what schools you're from. Let's get a school shout out here. Write it in the chat. What school are you from? Represent. Yeah, Rivera High School. United, Harlingen, yeah. Roma, very nice. Look at them all. Oh my God. PSJA, Porter. So we're going to go over the etudes. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat so I can address them more specifically. But we're going to go over some strategies for getting a bigger sound on bass clarinet, for extending the range in bass clarinet, and for being more confident starting notes on articulations, which is also very important. All right. So we're going to start with number 32 because it's very similar to what we did. Now, the very first thing I'm going to check with bass clarinetists if they're getting a small pinch sound is going to be their position on the mouthpiece. It's very easy to take too little mouthpiece on the bass clarinet. So one of my favorite tricks, you've probably seen someone use the business card before. That can be a great way to decapitate reeds. So if you're worried about the student, you can also just have them hold it up to the light and they'll see how the reed comes down to the mouthpiece, and ask them to put their thumbnail where it meets the mouthpiece. I like to do it with my right hand, and then you put the lower lip right where that thumbnail is. And you should get a bigger sound right away just on the mouthpiece and the neck. So if you do that one more time, what you can also do, if it's a repeat offender, you can draw a line in pencil right there. So they don't have to do that every time. They can just find it. And set up easily. Okay. So that's the first obstacle to get over. Now, the same things we talked about before are also true on bass clarinet. On bass clarinet, we like to say, oh, well, we don't have to play scales. We don't have to use a drone. But the bass clarinet has many more intonation problems than the B-flat clarinet, so it's very important to instill that right away. And I have an intonation method that I really like that I took from Kadai method because he has a really great pattern for introducing intervals. So he starts with the minor third because it's easiest to hear, and I have some long tones set up with minor thirds. If you're interested, just send me a message in the chat and I'm happy to connect you up with it because it works really well on bass clarinet. So when we feel the pulse in eighth notes, we have more possibility of getting stagnant air on bass clarinet than we do on B-flat clarinet because it takes more air and students get tired. So it's very important to think subdividing through the phrase and to put in those numbers. The most trouble your bass clarinets might have at the beginning is actually getting the softs. This can be a good problem for band directors because we always want more sound. But when it comes to TMEA, it can be a big problem for expressiveness because if you can't play soft, you have no flexibility within the note. So a really good exercise to work on that is similar to the 12ths that we did, but we're going to add a hairpin crescendo. So for instance, you're going to start on the C. And work into a decrescendo. And then you're going to start on the G. And a lot of times, just having to come from the higher note to the lower note, the students will keep the integrity of the jaw better than they do when they go up to a high note, and they'll have more space. And that's really what allows us to be delicate with the dynamics, is if we have resonant space and the lower lip isn't pressing up on the reed. So another thing that helps with bass clarinet sometimes, I tell students to think that there are 2 points of contact with the lower lip. So we roll it over the teeth, and there's the outer point, and there's also an inner point. And on bass clarinet, it can be very helpful to think of maintaining connection with the inner point. If we use the outer point, it tends to squeeze up and into the reed. But if you use the inner point, it tends to squeeze out a bit and support the reed. Making those intervals easier. Squeak warning, if I push up, a lot of times you'll hear that squeak, which is really just a partial, it's just a note you didn't want right then. And good news, the bass clarinet has plenty of those. Bass clarinet has so many partials. It really should give some away. No, it shouldn't. It's what makes the sound so rich. But the first thing I want to do with bass clarinetists is talk about how much mouthpiece to take in and to encourage them to try getting those squeaks on purpose and feeling the lower lip pressing up. Because once they feel it, they're aware of it. But if there's tension, we never really know until we experience a less tense position. Like when you come home from work and someone touches your shoulder and they're like, oh my God, and you're like, what? And then you're like, oh, oh yeah, okay. And I'm sure that's all band directors right now with the state of things. So it's very important to show them a place of lesser tension so that they can experiment with it. All right, so these situations can cause a little more of a problem on bass clarinet. The accent, it's very important that it happens with the air and not with the squeezing of the lip. So practicing the backwards accents. Helps with pitch tremendously, because if you're using your tongue in the squeeze, you get a lot of change in pitch. And we have enough of that on the bass clarinet, we don't need any more. Sometimes you'll find that bass clarinetists are on the bass clarinet because maybe their hands are bigger, maybe they're less accurate, and the fact that they're covered holes are helping them out, but that's going to get in their way pretty seriously when they get to the trill that we went over on the B-flat clarinet. So when you're trilling on the bass clarinet, it's even more important than on the B-flat clarinet to think about the note that you're starting on, that F sharp. It's very easy to split the air on the bass clarinet, but if you focus on that lower note, then you have a little less clumsiness. Now, it is a big instrument. There are bigger keys. If you want to iron that out even more, you can use the same patterns we talked about before, but put them on groups of 3. So I'm going to put the metronome on 8th notes. And I'm going to, oh yeah, I need them. So I'm going to put it on the 8th note pulse, and then I'm going to put it on 8th notes. Ba-dee-da-da. And I'm going to do long, short, short, long. And that'll help me to even it out. So those patterns work for a lot of music, and what's really cool is that they help students subdivide pulse a little more, because they have to separate the actual beat from the triplet or the 8th note subdivision. And it just, I mean, it's so easy for students to spend their entire high school career terrified of cut time, and we need to give them more practice having the beat and doubling the beat so that they feel comfortable. All right, and then for the alternate, I mean, I really suggest anytime you have to switch to the alternate, it's even more awkward on bass clarinet. So I would really suggest holding off with that until where I marked it there, right there. When you're playing these runs, you want to as well find the highest note and work down from there. So bass clarinet, if we're squeezing as we get up to it, we'll never get it out, and we'll get used to just hearing an undertone on that note. And we don't want to settle for that kind of defeat. So help them start on that higher note and practice coming out of it. so that they can feel confidence, and especially at the end. If you start that one at the end and then add a little bit more each time, you're really enforcing good voicing habits. So we spent a little more time on this one. I kind of want to jump to the next one. Is that okay with everybody? Yeah? Okay, cool. You guys are hardcore. You're in it for the clinic all day. In it to win it. All right, let's jump to number 10. So, number 10 requires a lot of hand position fluidity on the bass clarinet, in the sense that those notes are very close together and it's easy to get off. Let me pull up my music. There it is. I can't stress enough how important it is to start with the slurs. So that you're not slowing the air down. Slur 2, tongue 2 is the most clarinetastic articulation ever. I get on my soapbox about this sometimes, but I think we're the only ones who do it. And what it can do when we're squeezing off at the ends of the slurs, we go dee, 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 and we get really tight. So sometimes just reversing it helps to create the forward air. So you can even do little loops. So to do the loop successfully, you want to go to the 5th note. And you'll get good air habits going. So just like we talked about before, you're going to find the highest note in the line, and a lot of times I'll even separate it out from the actual line. So this very opening bit that goes up to an A, that can make some bass clarinetists uncomfortable already. So I would practice starting the A super soft, and articulating it to get it louder. And again, if they're having trouble starting soft, you want to check their position on the reed, and you also want to reinforce the teeth on the mouthpiece and creating more space between the chin and the nose. And all of a sudden it'll be much easier to go through that when you practice the A, A, F, F, D, D. Once that's comfortable, it's easier to push through. All right, so if there's a wide interval, just like with the octaves, you're going to practice going from high to low. So where am I thinking about? I'm thinking about like at 35. Each time you're looking for tension on that high note. When it creeps in the jaw, you're going to get that little chirp. And you want to make sure that they can do it multiple times in a row instead of one time and get lucky. And you can repeat it with each of those intervals. Another really important one to think of that on is the high C down to the C. Which is, what, 2 before 40? And that's a very important one as well. So 10 goes pretty high for your high school bass clarinetists. Bass clarinet can go up to the stratosphere, it truly can, but it's pretty high for your high school bass clarinetists. So when you're trying to extend their range, this is my tried and true and favorite way to do it. So it operates on the idea that the register key is a tool and not a crutch. So we can get the notes without the register key, but the register key helps us to resonate it more. If we can find resonance already on the note without the register key, we're in really good shape. So if you jump to the 3rd line of this sheet, you'll notice this is very similar to what we did at the very beginning of the class, and all of this works super well on bass clarinet. I always want to make sure that my students can go from C, G, C. Back and forth, because that shows that they're not grabbing on the top note where we feel all the tension. But the third line is really my favorite. So we're going to use alternate fingerings. We're going to slur up to the G. And when we get to the C, you see how it's in parentheses right there? We're going to go off, on, off, on, off, on with the register key. And once that's comfortable, you can challenge them to see how long they can hold it. And if that's comfortable, see if they can do a decrescendo. And at that point, you know that their air is fast and they're not squeezing up with the lower lip. And at that point, you're ready to adventure on into the great beyond. So I also use an alternate fingering to keep that air in a happy place and to keep the confidence level high, because the regular C sharp and D can be pretty treacherous on the bass clarinet. So once we get used to dropping the register key, we're going to switch from just the thumb to the first finger. And then we can go to D, which is going to be like the overblown G. And to the A flat, which is going to be a D sharp. And then even to the A, which is an E. And you can add the B flat, which is the F. And it's usually easy for students to stay open here, but if they do close, they're going to hear it right away. And then it's going to drop. So when they close, the air is going to drop, the note's going to thud, and you're going to know that they're biting. So this just encourages them to open up. Once that's comfortable, you're going to ask them to articulate on that note. And at that point, you'll see if the tongue is being really heavy. And then after that, you're going to look for even more openness, and you're going to transition to the real fingering. So that's what I just did. And if they're not open, they're going to squawk on it like that. And it's exactly that alternation that I talked about between pressing with the outside of the lower lip and pressing with the inside. It's also a cool sound. If that doesn't make them want to play in the higher register, I don't know what will. And you can work your way up. And at that point, they're going to feel much more comfortable with those notes. I also have phantom tones there. All of these articulations are really good patterns for bass clarinets who are struggling there. To start soft. And then we start doing intervals. And they get bigger and bigger. So they find more openness and consistency. Because all we're looking for is strength in the lower lip where it's still and it's a firm cushion instead of pushing, which is actually a sign of weakness. You got to encourage them to think of those planks. You know, a plank is an ultimate sign of strength. Planks are the worst. All right, any questions about that? Have you tried that before on bass clarinet? Yeah. All right, we got a true believer. Excellent. So, some other things to do in this etude are to, instead of using that slur 2, tongue 2, to use slur 3, tongue 1. So that they're sending the air to the end of the phrase. And you can also do tongue 1, slur 3. And that's going to encourage confident starts on the notes. And I always encourage my bass clarinets, you know, do it big. If you're going to squawk, do it big, but make sure there's plenty of air behind it. The hee-haws are a huge problem on the bass clarinet. The 12ths that we talked about are very helpful. I've also found that when we do them backwards from the G down to the C, students are more able to feel if the space behind their teeth changes. Usually when we go forwards, we're just trying to get them to the higher register, and we're focusing on keeping the air the same, and it's a great exercise to use, but they don't really feel when it gets tighter. It's a lot easier to feel when it gets looser. Hee-haw, instead of hee-hee, hee-haw. And that'll help them to see the difference and go, oh, I don't really need to do that to get that note out. And I like to remind them to think of a finger or a pencil width of space between the upper and lower jaw. And when we make more space for the higher note, it's usually more in tune, and the transition is easier. So the other thing in that tricky C section, you want to aim for the A. If you aim past the C, you'll have less tension on the C. And then for the end, for measure 40, I like to encourage them to think about their head getting taller as they get louder and higher. Sometimes I'll also tell them to think about sending the air out the top of their head, like a blowhole, or even a little bit out and behind. And then hopefully you have a little left, a little space left for a nice little decrescendo at the end. And all of that work without the register key paid off if they can do that. Because you can bet there aren't going to be many high schoolers who arrive confidently on that F and then taper it. Like, I am master of the universe. And the TMEA judges are going to notice. They're going to notice that kid. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind with bass clarinet, it's even more important, I think, kind of like with oboe, to take the time to exhale before a new phrase, because it's a bigger aperture and it's even easier to pick up that tension. So I really encourage them before the cantabile to let some of that out so you don't get that squeak. And a lot of that comes from sending the air low down in the back instead of from the neck. There's one more thing. Ah, yes. In measure 32, it's another tricky spot. 32, 32. There it is. A lot of times we squeeze on the E because we think of it as the highest point. So you want to put a little fermata on there so they can practice opening up so that they can come back down. There's also some resistance from the D to that B flat. So they might use open, but that's going to be tricky for voicing for high schoolers. So I would actually recommend the real fingering. But at that point, I like to tell them to think of like a Mario Kart burst of air. You know, when the cart hits it. Luckily, Mario Kart is still a thing. I don't know what I would do if it wasn't. They still know. Probably in 2 years it'll be gone, but I'm going to use it for all it's worth until then. Okay, so another exercise I really like to work on with number 15, because number 15 is also a little tight in those, we call it a passaggio point on the bass clarinet. It's just kind of hard to transition in there. It's easy to get partials. I like to encourage them to get to know their partials. So we use the harmonics, and actually the 12th harmonic on the bass clarinet is pretty touchy, so I start with the 5th. So you start with the C, slur up to G, lift the first finger to go to E. You want to re-articulate it. And let them play around with that. So that's probably the most common squeak that you get on bass clarinet. And then once they can get it, You can let them try and get it with the register key on and off, and then without it. And they'll understand a lot more about voicing on the bass clarinet when they can do that. But that's not all. We can make more obnoxious sounds. So we can go from the E to the A. And then we can get all of them. I know you're looking forward to hearing that in your band hall every morning at 8. But it's so helpful. And I mean, if they do it in the band room, they're not doing it at home. Well, they're probably doing it at home. Well, now they are doing it at home. So you don't have to hear it. Oh, man. We got to make sure that their parents don't make them stop band, though. That would be bad. So getting this flexibility is really, really helpful. And one of my favorite things to do on bass clarinet that new composers actually really like, I've done it in a lot of pieces for electronic music, I call it the sad dolphin noises. So once you get those higher partials, you just do a little gliss. Sad dolphin. Doesn't it sound like a sad dolphin? And they go up really quite high. So I'll leave that to your judgment if you want to teach them that, but it's really a great way to master the rest of the bass clarinet. And it's fun to tell them that, yes, on bass clarinet it's possible to play up to high C. No problem. So then you do from C all the way up with each partial, and you can challenge them to see how many they have. And again, that third one is always the hardest. So don't worry so much about that one, but if they can get the higher ones, they will be well off. So all of that gives us more resonance for the opening of, which are some of the worst notes on the bass clarinet. The F sharp, the B, it's all just not very pretty. So we need every bit of resonance we can get. And again, we're going to want to use the ski slope. So that we're pumping air through the ends instead of ha, 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 he, with an H on the end, he. There was another spot, altissimo D, so that overblown open G, I think it's really going to come in handy in a couple of spots, like in the odd tempo here, and also here, because it happens in these groups a lot as a second or third note. And it's just easier instead of trying to mess with the pinky finger. And then the other one, yeah, the odd tempo. And that's a C sharp, so I would actually probably use the first finger as well. So if they're getting that little squeeze, they're biting already. You want to start from that note so that you can get into it. So I'm just using that B as a pivot point so that I can move through it instead of always winding up to fail at that spot. We want to build confidence. Okay, other sand traps, the grace notes and trills, curved pinky, even on the bass clarinet, so important. The high Ds using an alternate, and the fast he, air at the end of each slur. Ooh, yeah, and then at the end with measure 35. So bass clarinet articulation can be pretty tricky in that students often come from the B flat clarinet. There are two camps. They come from the B flat clarinet and they want to be super precise and use a very small part of the tongue, tip to tip, just like they did on B flat. And it usually ends up in a lot of squeaks. Or they've started on bass clarinet all of their life and their tongue lives low in their mouth in a cave and goes flat, 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 and they're happy with it. So I usually suggest something in between, and this is something that we went over with the principal bass clarinetist of the Houston Symphony, and it's to use a more, it's like a hybrid syllable. Instead of T or li, it's kind of a hiss, 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 hiss. So it helps the tongue to prep a little bit on the reed. Hisk or hist, either of them works. Hiss, 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 hiss. If you try saying it, it preps the air, hiss, 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 without putting such a hard front on it. Because the bass clarinet, again, tension is its worst enemy. It will squawk at you all day long. But if you keep the tongue in a more relaxed position, and you do have to be a little bit flexible. I mean, I hate telling my students this because I'm all about tip of the tongue to the tip of the reed. And some of them will even be like, it's not possible, Dr. VR, it's not possible. And as band directors, you'll appreciate this story, but when I was in Cincinnati, in 1 hour I taught, I think, 30 kids how to make a sound on the B-flat clarinet. And I was still pretty young, and I didn't read all of the instructions on the sanitizing bottle, and they all made a sound. It was awesome, but at the end when I put it away, I looked at it and I was like, oh, let it evaporate. Oh no. And they didn't provide an instrument, so it was my instrument. They all played my instrument. Well, I got hand, foot, and mouth disease, which causes little pressure blisters everywhere where you make contact, so on your feet and on your fingers. And I was preparing a concerto with an ensemble, and I went to rehearsal and I had a fever, and afterwards I realized I had little blisters on each of my fingers where they touched the keys and on the tip of my tongue. So I tell them that, and I say, yes, it is possible. But it is not always the best plan of attack on bass clarinet. So on bass clarinet, you want to be flexible, and you want to see, some notes might prefer to be articulated a little lower. The Grand Canyon Suite is a really great example of that. It's not going to hit in the exact same spot each time, but it's pretty close. So I don't usually tell students that because it's close enough that if I tell them, oh yeah, it hits in different places, they're going to be thwap, 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 wherever they want. But the hiss or hisk syllable helps prepare it and helps relax the air a bit so we don't have that built up pressure that comes with T sometimes. So that ending, here it is. And that one I would probably use a regular C sharp up at 40, but it's going to be really important that it comes out clean at 35. We can hide a lot of articulation things with the slurs, but those ascending scales, you probably want to practice them downwards. The good news is that it only happens twice, and they only use 2 different groupings. It's the G that happens twice, and then at the beginning you have the lower octave of it. So it's really not that bad for bass clarinetists.